which is roughly equivalent to Christian evangelism. I don't know what the Antichrist end times religion will be, but I think it'll have a lot of the same characteristics of Islam. Will it be Islam exactly? I don't know. But I think that what this material we're looking at is really illustrative of how false religion spreads, not through good arguments, but by having a dominant narrative, encouraging blind obedience, following leaders as opposed to ideas, that kind of thing. So this is part 3 of a series we've been looking at Bilal Phillips's Dawa manual, how to do, basically teaching Muslims how to do Dawa, how to reach out and spread the religion. In the first 2 parts, we looked at kind of like what is the definition of Dawa, how Bilal supports the idea, and then the characteristics of the people doing the Dawa and the characteristics of those receiving it. We saw that he has manipulated both his audience, the Muslims reading it, and how he's encouraging them to manipulate others.
Yeah.
So in this 3rd part, we're going to look at what he calls general considerations for doing Dawa, but really is how to respond to common complaints about Islam. And we'll see that it's a combination of irrelevant ideas, distractions, and outright lies. Anything you'd like to say?
And he often contradicts himself, which is...
Yeah, it feels like he's just throwing out a whole bunch of things and hoping something sticks. He doesn't really care if he's creating a cohesive argument. The idea is kind of...
You mentioned something earlier about the end times religion, and I know Sonia has spoken about this and posted on this recently. Antifa are very much involved with Islamic terror groups like Hamas. And Sean King recently, as well, I think, what do they call him? Talcum X. He recently put out a tweet about tearing down all statues of Jesus. Now, we know that if you read through and you listen to the discussions by the leaders of groups like Antifa and BLM, they're Marxist, and Marxist is anti-Christian. So it's no surprise that someone like Sean King would be saying, and BLM and Antifa would be saying, tear down statues of Jesus, because those are ideologies and moralities that stand against what they stand for.
Definitely. Just one more housekeeping note before we get started. We will try to pay attention to the chat. So if you have any questions as we go along, throw those in the chat. So as I said, our presentation is on Dawa, the Islamic equivalent to evangelism. We're going to be looking at some arguments technically, but more like distraction techniques that Bilal suggests to answer some common problems in Islam.
He does the very same thing that they do in the YouTube comments. When they throw out something, you answer it, and then they immediately bring up something else. They don't admit that they were wrong. They don't admit the fault in their previous argument. They simply just switch, and he does the very same. Changes subject.
Yeah, and like Lloyd said, he often puts up contradictory ideas. He doesn't really care if it's a good argument. He just wants to put something out there so he can change the subject, move on to something else. Did you want to go ahead and pull up the slides?
Yeah, I would need to start sharing. Okay, that is ready. Good. Oh, you've disabled screen share.
Yep, I was just checking that. All right, it should be fine now.
Yeah, I want to get to and there we go. All right, so welcome to Dawa Part 3. And as you can see, these are general Dawa issues that he deals with. These are mostly embarrassments, which he wants his followers to deal with And a lot of it is based on just deflection. He often doesn't directly deal with the issues. And the first one he brings up is polygamy. And your thoughts, Thaddeus?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. There's a couple telling things here. One, that he brings this up first, and then two, he goes into like great depth of this one. I guess he thinks that this is one that he can really address. It's not till the very end that he addresses things like spreading Islam by violence, and then he only gives a really, really brief explanation for those. Like it's almost like he's saying, this is an issue that we can really answer. There's other issues, we don't have a lot to say about them. We'll just go over them really quickly. But this one, I think I can say a lot, which is interesting because the arguments he gives are quite bad. He starts off.
Go on, sir.
He starts off with this number one, that Islam did not introduce polygamy, which I mean is technically true, but it's not an argument that it's morally right. Islam didn't introduce anything, really. Every sin imaginable already existed. Are you going to say that murder's right because it existed before Islam? I mean, it's just silly.
Yeah, he says it regulates polygamy, but doesn't forbid it. Of course, he then also made the claim previously that Islam is the only religion that specifically allows one wife. That is not true. Very many verses in the Bible specifically reference a man and a woman are husband and wife and single partner. Whereas he says that that's so, but then he goes on in the very next paragraph, as we discussed last week, he then talks about up to 4 wives. So how is that one wife?
Yeah, that's a good point. That even on this issue, he's already contradicting something he said earlier in the Dawa manual. That he repeated this lie, which I hear, from Zakir Naik and other Muslim apologists, not just Bilal, that Islam is the only religion whose scriptures say to take only one wife. And then, of course, you look up the actual verse, and then they've taken a couple words out of the middle of the verse. The real verse is like, take 4 wives, but if you fear that you can only handle one, well, then only take one, and as many sex slaves as you desire. So it's kind of ridiculous to say that the verse teaches anything like that.
He goes on to say in this one, no woman in her right mind will allow her husband to marry another woman. However, this violates the law of Allah, and therefore her thoughts don't matter.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy stuff. So then he goes on, number 2, he talks about how many men in the West have mistresses or extramarital affairs or whatever, which again is, well, he says most, which I don't think it's most, but even if it was 99%, it wouldn't make it right. I mean, just because a lot of people do it doesn't mean that it's right. And, we write, so because people will do it anyway, go ahead and make it legal, I guess, is his argument, which is kind of stupid.
2 wrongs don't make a right. And having a mistress is clearly a violation of your marriage contract. And that also is you're not married to her. So how can you claim that this claim to monogamy is false? That is, you're not married to them. You don't have a legal obligation to these mistresses that you supposedly
have. So then we go on, and we'll cover this one in a little more depth just to give you an idea of the kinds of arguments. And then on later ones, we'll just point out a couple examples. If you want to bring up the next slide. Then he claims that monogamy is illogical, basically because if you are having sex with multiple women and only one of them are married, only one can be like your legal heir and stuff, which is, again, just saying, well, people will violate the moral laws, so I guess don't have any moral laws is his argument. It's rather silly.
Just a comment that's popped up. Yohana Mat in the comments said there's no commandment against more than one wife in scripture. In fact, there's a responsibility to take on a brother's wife to give him offspring. I'm not sure. I'm sure that occurs in the Old Testament. I'm not sure that is applicable to us. But for instance, it is not good that a man should be alone. I will make a helper fit for him, right? And Adam had Eve. And then, of course, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, not his wives. And the 2 will become one flesh, not a ménage à trois. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. Two shall become one flesh, and not three or four or five. In John 10, I am the gate, and so on. Sorry, I'll leave it at that. Your thoughts, Thaddeus?
Yeah, so we see in creation that the ideal is one man and one woman, and it's true that there was no law against it, but the law, like, it was allowed, but the law did strongly discourage it. We see the narrative strongly discourages it, that whenever someone takes multiple wives, it creates problems. So, there's more than one way to teach something besides an explicit command. And then in the New Testament, we read passages like a pastor should be a husband of only one wife. We see Jesus saying that men and women were created to be in a marriage of one man and one woman. So what he said is technically true, right? There's no command you can point to that says, oh, this command says to take only one wife. There's no command that says take as many wives as you want.
If that statement fell within a different area, for instance, there are multiple different, you can call them testaments, I guess, but you have the agreement that God made with Moses, with David, there's with Noah, and there's with Jesus. Those are the four major, what's the term that I'm looking for? Not testaments, but these were the four
covenants.
Covenants, correct. So those covenants are past. We're now in the time of the new covenant. That's the one with Jesus. Those ideas now become relevant. We're not living under the law of Moses. If you're a Christian, you're not living out of the Old Testament.
Absolutely. And likewise, there's no command against having multiple husbands. So if you're going to say that this only applies to men, then that argument is just totally blew up in your face.
Yeah. You also don't find any of the old patriarchs, I think, that have multiple wives. And even then, sexual immorality was considered against the law, but also immoral. Where the Ten Commandments, this person may have heard of the Ten Commandments.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and move on to point number 4.
Okay.
Which is supposedly that men were created polygamous because of a need in society. He argues that there's a surplus of women in most human societies, which is false. He quotes a few statistics where there's a slight imbalance, like 53, 53-47 or 52-48. And then he ignores all the other countries where there's an imbalance in the other way. In particular, the Islamic countries have at least the Middle Eastern ones, have a massive imbalance. It's like almost 2-to-1 in some cases, men to women. So by his argument, I guess that women should be allowed to take multiple husbands and not the other way around. And of course, historically, this was sometimes true because men were more likely to die in war. On the other hand, women were much more likely to die in childbirth back then than they are today. So I don't think there was ever a society where there was like this massive imbalance of 4-to-1 men to women, or women to men. So it's just kind of nonsense. And then he cites this suggestion that women outlive men, which is technically true. Women do have a couple year longer life expectancy than men, but no one's marrying an 80-year-old widow as their second wife. They want a 16-year-old virgin as their second wife. They don't want to. No one's going to be marrying these widows even in Islamic countries. So it's
a lot of what he says is not relevant. After World War II, resulting in legalization of prostitution, German prostitutes are considered workers. Okay, Islam has polygamous marriage. Why are we talking about German prostitutes and health benefits and pay taxes? That, I don't get that. He does also mention, there's a surplus of women, and he goes and he mentions the Western statistics, but he fails to mention any Islamic countries, which is really interesting. Why does he fail to do that? And when you do look at those statistics, you discover that there's actually a surplus of men and too few women. So how do they, you go through the stats here, Thaddeus.
Yeah, so we got some European countries, Ireland, England, very, very slight imbalance, more men than women, or I'm sorry, more women than men. US 103. China, China gets this reputation for killing its female babies, but there's only a slight imbalance. Only 95 females for every 100 males. And then you look at some other countries and, you see roughly 50-50. And then you get to these Middle Eastern countries. Qatar, 48 women for every 100 men. United Arab Emirates, 47 for 100. Saudi's a little better at 85 to 100, but still more men than women in all these countries. And, China gets this rap for killing the female infants, which they do in some places, but clearly not at nearly as great a rate as the Middle East. And I've never heard anyone ever criticize the Middle East for aborting females, but they must be. I mean, that's the only explanation.
Yeah. Yeah. So if there's a shortage of women, severe shortage of women, how do you, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to take his argument seriously here, they should be allowing women to have multiple husbands and not the other way around.
Yeah, at least two, because the ratios are approximately 2 to 1. There's still a severe shortage. So also, which men are the ones that are getting the women? Must be the wealthy ones, the ones with privilege. So this is, yeah, he doesn't go into any of this. I mean, this question here, what is going on in the Middle East? So other countries in the world follow a roughly 1-to-1 norm. So yeah, these are things that he doesn't seem to want to discuss.
If you could go back to our slide just for a second, go back one more before the stats popped up over the top of it. Because there was the 0.5, which he tries to say that male lions have lots of mates, which is, I mean, true, but totally irrelevant. We're not lions. And then he makes this claim that polygamous marriages reduce the spread of sexually transmitted diseases. And I actually did some real research on that. It turns out it's totally false. Even if you assume that person in a monogamous relationship cheats on their partner and ends up having the same number of total sexual partners as they would where they could take 4 polygamous partners, it still spreads more quickly in polygamous environment due to the simultaneous nature of the relationships.
Wow. So completely fact-free statements from our friend Bilal Phillip. So shall we move forward?
Yep, go ahead on to 7 and 8. He claims that it protects the interests of women and children, and the reason it does is because the men have all the power and write all the rules. So how about we just let women participate in the legal system instead of making this male-oriented rule to supposedly protect their interests?
Yeah, but he speaks of monogamy allows them to enjoy extramarital affairs without economic consequence. Then what is the practice of mutta in Islam, where they can literally marry a woman for 60 minutes, take her to a hotel, and have no economic consequences whatsoever? Or, in fact, it says you can have 4 wives, but let's extend that. You can have 4 wives at a time. You can say the words talaq, talaq, talaq 3 times, divorce your wife, marry a fresh one, and hey, you're now on your 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 12th wife, as long as you have only 4 at a time. Muhammad had 22 wives during his career. 22. Yes, they'll say, yeah, well, he had 11 wives at one. Yeah, 11 wives at one given occasion. He had 22 in total that we know of. My rant over.
Yes. No, that's correct. 4 at a time doesn't mean 4 over your lifetime. When one dies or you decide to divorce her easily, as we'll see in a later objection, you can take another wife, you can have sex with as many, and of course it also allows you to have unlimited sex slaves.
Yes.
On. So, you know, this idea that polygamy would protect women's interests or it would prevent the spread of STDs is just utter nonsense.
So you can have 4 wives and unlimited slaves, and thus you can have dozens of children. And how much do you pay slaves, Thaddeus? Economically, what are the consequences?
Right. Yeah, I mean, you have to feed them and you have to clothe them and stuff, but no other way, just their bare minimum needs.
Yeah, but then he goes on to say the family problems and marital disputes are multiplied.
Yeah,
You know, and
we agree.
they're,
The reason
yeah,
against it.
and they're reluctant due to the psychological burdens of handling more than one wife. I mean, so really, well, what is he trying to tell us?
Yeah, I don't know. You know, he offers this that only a minority practice it, and then he's like, you know, it's legal, but only a minority do it, so it's no big deal. It's legal, I guess. And those who do it, there's consequences. Yeah, exactly. That's why it's against God's law to have polygamous marriages. You know, going back to that comment earlier that we see in the Bible, even though it was nominally allowed for a time period as a, you know, a concession of God, whenever someone chose to do that, the narrative shows that they did something wrong because they have moral, long-term consequences for doing that. So, you know, we agree, Bilal. It causes problems. That's a reason why it should be illegal, not why it should be legal.
Yeah. Yeah, this human was trying to frame it very poorly, though, as in, does God change his mind? Well, he had an agreement with someone. That person's no longer here. It's a different time and place. Now he has a different agreement. Things have changed. So, yeah, that's something I think that isn't nothing strange about that.
And number 9's a doozy here because he says, you know, conditions have been added for polygamy in some Muslim countries. And you think, okay, you know, they're being reasonable about it. And then he goes on and says, they did this against God's will, against Allah's will. It's like, well, thanks for bringing that up and proving our point.
It negates the permission given by Allah. Yeah, and it's a result of colonial domination. So who's he blaming? Just out of curiosity. And then no woman in her right mind will give her husband permission to take a second wife. So he has no concern, and Allah has no concern for the woman.
Yeah, you think he's bringing this up to say that it's not so bad because for example, in Egypt, the wife has to give her permission, and he's like, yeah, but no woman in her right mind would do that. Exactly why you should allow polygamy. It's so silly.
Yeah.
And then number 10, likewise, he said that some have said that polygamy shouldn't be done for lust, and you're like, okay, he's making a reasonable limitation on polygamy, and then he goes on to say, nope, those people are wrong, that all marriage is about lust, apparently, in his mind. Pretty disgusting there. And he's like, the only reason you married your first wife is because you were lusting after and you wanted to have legalized sex with her.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much we could say that's wrong with that. Lust fades as well. And there has to be something to replace it. There's got to be something deeper and something longer that maintains that relationship. So yeah, these are such shallow reasons he provides. And he says that to try to curb your lust will lead to corruption in society. That's an inversion of the Christian ethic, which is that lust leads to corruption. And he's saying curbing your lust. My head wants to explode.
Yeah, we mentioned at the beginning that a little bit about the Antichrist religion. Whether Islam is the Antichrist religion is certainly a Antichrist religion that it agrees on some unimportant points, and then they try to say that we agree on most everything, but we disagree on the most crucial points. The exact things that Jesus taught as the most important. But we're basically the same religion. We just want you to give up your core beliefs. That's all.
Yeah, no, exactly. Shall we go to the next?
Yep. And these are his last two comments on the issue of polygamy. And like I said, we won't go into as much depth on the other ones. But then he says that feminists object that this is a male only right and that women should be allowed to marry 4 husbands. And he says, nope, that you can't do that because there's a surplus of women, which we've already seen is false. So, and then he says, furthermore, no child would accept his mother identifying the father by the eeny, meeny, mighty, mo method. And, okay, just change those words around. No child would accept his father identifying the mother by the eeny, meeny, mighty, mo method. I mean, it's just nonsense. If it's wrong for a man or for a woman to have multiple husbands, then it's wrong for a man to have multiple wives. Both of his arguments are total non-starters.
Yeah.
And then in number 12, he basically says points number 1 through 11 are totally irrelevant anyway, because according to the Quran, God commanded this. So, it's God's command. What you think doesn't matter. So, I gave 11 points for no real reason. All you really have to do is accept that the Quran teaches it, and that's all that matters.
So it says that divine legislation seeks to maximize benefit, but for whom? Because he says the woman would never agree to this. Women don't like this. Women don't want this. It leads to psychological stress. And he's like, we want this. It's just assertion. Brian says something very interesting. You can have 72 virgins in paradise, but at the same time in Islam, the Prophet said most of the inhabitants of hell will be women. So, well, I mean, these are houris. These are not women. These are these houris in paradise a type of demon, a creation? Or what are they? I mean, there's...
Yeah, I mean, the Quran's not super clear, and the Hadith contradict each other. In some instances, they appear to be specially created beings, that their only purpose is there to provide for the sexual
And are you
pleasure.
married to them?
That's also unclear. But then in other cases, the Hadith seem to imply that they're the Jewish and Christian women who were taken out of hell and given to the Muslim men. So I don't know.
Yeah, this gets very complicated. I don't know why he doesn't talk about their scriptures in detail at all in this. These are just assertions. It's opinions and assertions. Yeah, let's move on. It's just boggles the mind.
So then his second issue here is what he calls arranged marriage, but it's not what we would think of as arranged marriage, where, two families get together, one gives their son and the other the daughter. It's more that the man gets to pick whatever wife he wants, and the woman's father decides whether that's acceptable or not. So that's the way arranged marriage works in Islam. And then he gives this very bizarre defense in that he says Islamic law requires females must give their permission. And how do they give their permission? He quotes this absolutely disgusting hadith where Muhammad says women give their consent by being silent. So
they're saying nothing, they've agreed.
So you got this 12-year-old girl, her father says you're going to marry this man. What's she going to do? I mean, she's going to say yes, or she's going to be silent. And
if she disagrees, what's the punishment?
Yeah, and if she disagrees, her father will say, you're disobeying me, and if he so chooses, may beat her. So, real great consent there.
And women are spared having to look for their own mates as if, they're not capable.
Yeah, a lot of his defenses turn out to be quite sexist, and this would be a good example. Apparently women... it's a burden for women to look for a partner, but it's not a burden for men to look for a partner, apparently. I don't know.
Yeah, it just tells us the differences. Males and females are raised separately. I mean, none of these are just assertions and opinions about how things should be. I'm not really getting anything that's substantial here.
And then he makes another really bizarre point in that he hurts his case by bringing it up. He says it's become practice among some Muslims to force their children to marry their cousins. And you're thinking, okay, he's got to be bringing this up to condemn it and say they're violating the law. And then he basically says, no, this is good because it helps them immigrate to the West because, their cousin's already in the West. Oh, and, some girls didn't like this, so they ran away from home because they didn't want to marry their cousin, and then they lost their Islam. So, I guess forced cousin marriage is a good thing. I don't know why he brought it up, but Thanks for letting us know what Islam teaches.
Yeah, when I lived in the Middle East, I mentioned this before, that in the UAE, for instance, it became mandatory for any couples, Islamic couples that were going to marry, to do a blood and genetic test for specifically to prevent a disease called thalassemia, which is a genetic defect which causes issues with, I think, with the blood. But basically, this is based. The reason you get it is due to too little genetic differentiation. In other words, inbreeding. So, and these laws also, and these things are very much in place in the Gulf countries and other Islamic countries. Some make them public, some do not. However, obviously, many times these things are circumvented. But what happens is inbreeding is a real thing. First cousin marriage and so on causes lots of genetic issues. In the UK, for instance, I think 1/3 of all babies with genetic damage who are in the healthcare system are from Islamic families. Now, if you consider that in the UK, these are what, 3% of the population is responsible for a full third of the medical issues with that problem. This tells us that this is also not a healthy thing for marrying your cousins. And he says it becomes a means to make immigration.
Yeah, he does this a lot. He brings up points that don't help his case, and you think he's bringing them up to say that they're wrong, and then he just says they're right. So I don't know. Insight into Bilal's mind, or insight to the way Islam works, or both. I'm inclined to think both.
Yeah. And then he says many have run away from home rather than be forced to marry relatives. Now, this narrative he tells makes no sense. Like, he's saying he's obviously wanting to defend it, but then he says that women hate it so much they run away from home rather than marry relatives. And these girls are hidden and they will likely lose their Islam. But he says rather force them to do something they hate than to, it's like maybe he needs to look at this ideology.
Yeah, for real. The problem here is clearly the command to marry your cousin, not the girl running away from home. I mean,
Yeah, he's not doing a great job justifying any of this.
It's one of many instances of victim blaming in his thing. Like, if she'd just gone along with it, she wouldn't have lost her Islam. Yay. And so the next one is double standards. We already saw one instance of double standards where, men are allowed to take 4 wives and women are not allowed to take 4 husbands. This one, he calls it double standards, but he's really only talking about one particular issue. Specifically, that cat knocked over my light there. Lovely. So specifically that Muslim men are allowed to marry non-Muslim women, but Muslim women are not allowed to marry non-Muslim men. And all he can really say in this, he gives a couple things, but all he can really say is that the woman, if she married a man who wasn't a Muslim, she would stop being a Muslim, because, women have no free will of their own. They just got to do whatever their husband tells them. So that's why it's not allowed.
Yeah, this also tells us, though, that Islam does practice religious and ideological discrimination. And he then implies that our texts have been distorted and changed, provides no evidence, yet makes this. And how are these connected here? So he's changing tack. He's now switching the subject again. And yeah, when they were attacking in the 3 years after Muhammad died, when they invaded 28 countries, were those Christian countries? Because all of those are now Islamic countries. They've been converted by force. If they weren't Christians, were they marrying them? No, obviously they can marry whomever they want. At the end of the day, there's the rules may say one thing, but they practice another.
Definitely. And, and then point number 3 is totally irrelevant. And it's one of his many distractions. But he says in cases where Muslims are weak, they're in the minority, they're encouraged to only marry other Muslims, which one doesn't do anything about the double standard, because it's like this one special case, Muslim men are discouraged, not forbidden, just discouraged from marrying non-Muslim women, while women are still forbidden. But regardless, it gives a clear insight to what the thinking here is, that, it's just all about perpetuating Islam. It doesn't have anything to do with truth. It doesn't have anything to do with morals. It's just about what is in the best interest of making the most people Muslim. So the assumption behind both the rule and this last statement is that women are weak and women will just do whatever their husband tells them to do. So if a Muslim man takes a non-Muslim woman as his wife, he'll be able to force her to convert, and then they'll increase the number of people in Islam, so that's allowed. If it's a woman, she won't be able to get her husband to convert, and very well may convert to his religion, so it'll decrease the number of people in Islam, which is bad. And then for this weak situation, because the kids won't be forced to go to Islamic school, if both their parents aren't Muslim, if one of them is a non-Muslim, then the kids might not absorb the Muslim religion, and that won't increase the number of people in Islam. So that's bad. So it's just all about numbers. That's all it's about.
Yeah, and he says obviously they have strength in numbers. It's really just about strength in numbers. Where is he saying about the strength in the ideology, the morality? These are all over the place. It's really hard to fathom for us to understand how this works. Let's move to divorce.
So divorce is an interesting subject for Bilal, because he first tries to say that, divorce isn't actually easy in Islam. That's kind of a myth. For example, you can't divorce a woman while she's menstruating. Wow, great. Divorce is really hard. You got to wait up to 7 days before you can divorce her.
I can see how that can be hard. It's like, man, I saw this hot chick who worked at the supermarket. Now I got to wait a week. Yeah, Bilal, that's great. That's great.
Then he says that the divorce can be declared invalid if the man was in a state of great anger. It's kind of questionable whether the Hadithi sites even means that, but let's just give him the benefit of doubt and say that it means that. Well, who decides if it was invalid when he was enraged? Presumably the man. I'll say, well, never mind, I was enraged, so that divorce is invalid. I don't think the woman gets to say, my husband was just angry at me, the divorce is invalid. And then he'll be like, well, I'm not angry now, so I divorce you now. I mean, it's kind of a pointless limitation there. And then limitation number 3 is that the woman has to remain in the house for 90 days after she's been divorced, basically on house arrest. That she's supposed not to even leave the house. And the reason is, just in case she's pregnant, they need to know whose child it is. If she leaves the house, who knows? She might have sex with another man, and then you won't know whose child it is.
He doesn't explain any of this very well. He just makes statements and doesn't explain them. And it's really, my mind boggles. I mean, so yeah, the audience can make of this what they will. We're just showing you what they have and giving you our thoughts on this.
And then he ends up just saying, in the end, divorce is actually easy in Islam. So I raised those limitations for no reason anyway.
Yeah, and this point, this is very important here, Thaddeus.
Yeah, he says, and the reason for this is that marriage in Islam is just a contract. It's not a sacrament as perceived by the West, i.e. as perceived by Christianity. So, you gave the woman some benefits. You gave her a place to live. You provided money for her, food, helped her raise the children, whatever. And her end of the contract is she fulfills your sexual needs. And when the conditions of the contract are no longer needed, like, you're no longer attracted to her and she no longer fulfills your sexual needs, contract's over. Simple as that.
In the Sharia, a marriage in Islam is really just, effectively, it's defined as having legal sexual relations. That's all it is. Legally being allowed to have sex, because if you did and you weren't married, you'd be killed. It's a crime. You'd be stoned to death. So it's really just about legal sexual relations. And back to the point of this guy that came on earlier, I mean, a sacrament would be something holy, right? So you had Adam and Eve. You didn't see Adam, Eve, Jane, Susan, Martha, and Abigail. It was Adam and Eve, and that template was set. And a sacrament, I don't see how you could have how it's a sacrament to have 15 wives or something. That, how can you have a sacred bond between you and a harem?
Yeah, exactly. And, like Solomon, for example, the Bible says that he left the religion because he lusted after all these foreign wives and took all
Yeah.
these wives. And so that, there's consequences. There's consequences every time. When
Yeah.
Abraham decides to take matters into his own hand and have a child by Hagar instead of Sarah, there's long-term consequences of that action. It's not like, yeah, the Bible describes it existing, but that doesn't mean it approves of it.
Yeah, it's
They're not the
reporting
same
it.
thing.
It's reporting it as history. It's not presenting it as commandments. And besides, Solomon is not the template for Christians. Muslims will often say, yeah, but King John the 48th, in 1712, he married 3 women or whatever. Like, was he the founder of the Christian religion that I need to listen to this guy? Like, Muhammad versus some random king I've never even heard of? Like, Muhammad, some random dude Muhammad founded your religion, right? Deal with that. Moving on.
So the next issue he calls dress code. What he really means is women being required to wear face coverings or at least hair coverings, depending on how strict your sect of Islam is. And his justification is one of the most disgusting things among many disgusting things in his defenses. He says that, well, in the United States 100 years ago, women wore a lot more clothing and there was less incidences of reported rape. So the two must be related, that women are wearing less clothing now, so they're being raped more.
Victim blaming.
Yeah.
What's interesting? Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, just a little while ago when in Sweden, for instance, in the Slavic countries, I think there was a period during a 3-year period where there was loads of third world immigration into the Nordic countries, and there was one time when I think for 3 years, 100% of the rapes were by foreigners, immigrants, and it's insanity. The standards are very different. We have a very different view of this in the West, and he goes and he blames dress code. I mean, this has long since been laughed at because no matter what a woman wears, you have no right to lay a hand on her unless she is consenting to that. And he's now blaming them. And yeah, it's just wrong. It's too big a situation to unpack right now, but this is very, very wrong.
Yeah. So I don't want to, my main objection to this is that he's blaming the victim, but his argument is also invalid because he's only using reported rape. And the reason rape incidences of reported rape have increased is because women have gained more rights and they feel more comfortable believing that the justice system will actually do something and not just blame them. So they're more likely to report it now. And of course, he also uses raw numbers, which is totally irrelevant because the population has increased like tenfold. So even if the rate was exactly the same, the number of rapes would increase tenfold. So it's just,
he provides no source for statistics, and he doesn't discuss the fact that in Islamic countries, which has happened multiple times in the UAE, if a woman reports that she was raped, she could well be the one going to jail for having illegal sex, unless she's had multiple witnesses to back up her story. So women do not want to report it because they'll be the victim and they'll suffer for it.
Yeah, I mean, the vast majority of the time, the best case scenario for a woman reporting rape in a country with full Sharia law is that both she and the man go to jail. And in a lot of cases, she'll just go to jail because she won't have any witnesses to back her. And then they'll be like, well, you're bearing false witness. So you're admitting to having illegal sex and you're falsely accusing the man of raping you. So you're going to jail for that.
And this is disgusting. How can you allow women to expose themselves and then kill those who react unduly? as if these men had no self-control. These men had no ability to make a rational decision, as if they were animals.
Yeah, it's
He doesn't want
ridiculous.
men punished for raping women when it's the woman's fault for wearing that nice clothing.
Yeah, and by this logic, why don't we just make everything legal? We can't punish people for doing wrong things. That's not that fair. We provided the conditions for them. So I guess if you're a store owner and you put some nice looking merchandise in your window and someone breaks the window and takes it, I guess it's your fault because you put nice looking merchandise there and they couldn't control themselves. You should have hidden that merchandise away, and then it would have been their fault if they took it. But since you didn't hide it, it's your fault.
Yeah. And then he makes this crazy admission on the bottom here.
Even in the society of the prophet 1,400 years ago, some women were molested and raped. So in the end, the government doesn't do anything to stop rape.
Yeah.
So
Even when they fully covered, then they still be molested. Yeah.
And the modern statistics back it up. We couldn't find a lot of information about rape in the Middle East because it's so rare for women to report it for reasons we already gave. But there were studies about women being sexually harassed and molested. And in Egypt, 99% of women reported that they had been molested or sexually discriminated against. So apparently this is not solving the problem, and if anything, making it worse.
Yeah, I mean, just crazy how he tries to justify this. Yeah. Inheritance.
Yeah. You want to take this one?
Just briefly, no. We know, for instance, David Wood covered this in a very humorous video recently. But the percentages, if you add up all the proportions, don't add up to 100%. They add up to 107%, 108, 103, 97. Allah obviously cannot do mathematics. And this is very, very complicated. And Bilal Phillips doesn't speak about this at any length, but he lies about the rights for women to inherit. And then he implies that these rights were given to women. Sure, they were given the right to inherit, but for instance, 1/4, 1/2 at best, and the men then take everything. And a 7-year-old boy could inherit the household over the rights of his mother and his older sisters. I mean, this is insanity. And yeah, so he really brings out the fact that Islam is entirely sexist in this. And he then says here, so he says unfair inheritance. Well, he says, then he admits, yes, it is unfair because based on the male Islamic law, was the son twice the portion of the daughter. What if the son is 4 years old and she's 22?
Yeah, that could easily happen, especially when you got
does happen.
wives. Yeah,
it does happen.
And he says this is because men are responsible for maintaining women. So we need a sexist inheritance law because we have other sexist laws. Basically, is the argument. DHC21 asked if we had stats on rape in the Middle East, and there's two factors working against that. One is that women are hesitant to report it, and two, any official stats are going to come from the government, so the government also wants to cover it up, so they don't really report these things.
Yeah, I can tell you there's having lived in the Middle East for more than 10 years. There's lots of anecdotal evidence. You hear plenty about it, but yeah, it's never officially reported. They want to create the impression of having this very moral society, but it certainly does happen. Women are terrified. They have no protection under the law.
So we can go ahead and move on. And as you may have noticed, just about all these issues somehow deal with women's rights. It's like Bilal knows that this is a major, major problem in Islam, and that's all his efforts are concentrated on it. There aren't actually any things in this section about the immoral behavior of Muhammad, or there's only like a very brief material on violence in Islam, and I think there's two reasons. One, he knows this is a major problem, and two, the other things that we criticize Islam for, Muslims probably aren't generally aware of. Like, every Muslim knows that women get half the inheritance of men. Every Muslim knows that men can take 4 wives. But most Muslims don't know all the material that we talk about Muhammad, how he had people tortured and killed for money, and how he had way more wives than even the law allows, and how he married a 9-year-old girl. Most Muslims don't know this material, and Bilal doesn't want to tell them about it because then they would know it.
Let me perhaps bring this up briefly. There's a passage in, I believe it's Tabari, The Last Years of the Prophet, Volume 9, page 139, section 1777, where Layla bint al-Khattam goes to Muhammad and says, I've come to offer myself in marriage to you, so marry me. Now, notice this does not appear in the original. So I've come to offer myself to you. Now, there are other instances where women offer themselves to Muhammad. Now, in our context, when someone offers themselves, that is an entirely sexual proposition. That is not necessarily marriage. She says, so marry me, right? Now, he replied, I accept. She goes back to her people and tells her family that that the messenger of God would marry her. And they said, what a bad thing you have done. You are a self-respecting woman, but the prophet is a womanizer. Seek an annulment from him. She went back and asked him to revoke the marriage, and he complied. So we have from the most authoritative Islamic sources that Muhammad was a womanizer. I mean, why isn't Bilal speaking about this?
Yeah, and my only guess is because he knows that most Muslims are not aware of this material. So why introduce something that the Christian they're trying to, or the non-Muslim they're trying to talk to probably doesn't know, and the Muslim probably doesn't know.
He's the example that they're all trying to follow.
Yeah.
I mean, look at this, though. I mean, this principle is not applied in all. He lies here that this is about business contracts. I mean, once you look into this, this is not about business contracts. Yes, there are cases where the business contract would apply, but this is a universal principle. This is not a business principle. And he says here, women may forget some of the details, so their heads are small. So really, we need to deal with this for them as men. And then the mother would receive 12.5%, the daughter 29.2%, which is 1/3 of 7/8, and the son 58.3%, which is 2/3 of 7/8. Right. And then once you do the actual mathematics, it comes up to 107% of whatever.
Yeah. He may have found, well, so like there's a whole bunch of rules, right? So you get different numbers depending on how many children there are, and most of them don't add up to 100%.
The father dies, and his wife gets 12.5%. But how is that fair? How is that fair? Your mom inherits, and when the children are old enough, fine, she'll distribute to them. That's how our law works. What is this?
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, so the section that we're on now, he has it as a separate section, but it's really kind of the same thing, that women are being devalued, gives this business excuse, business contract excuse. However, Islam teaches that Muhammad is the best interpreter of the Quran. So Bilal's interpretation or excuse here is irrelevant, because in the Hadith, Muhammad tells us exactly what this two men, the witness of two men, or two women is equal to one man, means. And he tells us that it means that women are deficient in intelligence. It has nothing to do with business. It has to do with generalized intelligence, supposedly, which is factually false.
Yeah. And he speaks here like he tries to speak glowingly of women in areas of female expertise. In this case, it's giving milk to babies.
Yeah. And I guess this is the best example he could find of in all of the Islamic historical narratives and hadith and whatnot of a woman being treated equal to a man, is that she was allowed to testify on her own authority. She didn't need a second woman, on her own authority, that she had nursed 2 children.
DHC21 at Yahoo says Islamic inheritance maths adds up to 112.5%. I guess they didn't invent algebra after all. Extremely well said. I agree. Yeah, those numbers don't add up to 100%. They don't. There's no way they add up anywhere. It's either below or above, but it's insane. Allah can't speak English, can't do basic maths. No wonder, learning impaired.
Yep.
You know,
Doesn't understand science. He thinks that sperm is produced in the rib region and all kinds of things with this Allah. And finally, we get to Jihad, stuck on here at the very end. And all, these other points, he had like between 5 and 12 different defenses. Jihad, he has one paragraph, which is an outright lie. Pretty telling. I'll let Lloyd cover this one. He's the expert on Jihad.
maybe I should just bring up those couple of slides. I didn't think there's. I can just bring up those slides again and give me 1 second to. Okay, I'm going to display this. This is from Ibn Khaldun. He's a very famous Islamic scholar, very highly educated in the Islamic sciences, as they call it. So he knew the Quran, the Sharia, etc., etc. He's actually famed with Western scholars as well. He invented sociology, and he's considered Islam's greatest historian. He says here in his book, the Muqaddimah, which is considered the classic of Islamic history of the world. It's the first history of the world that we written, I think, in the 1400s. In the Muslim community, the holy war is a religious duty. Interesting that the finest historian that Islam has ever produced says that there's holy war in Islam and it's a religious duty because of the universalism of the Muslim mission and the obligation to convert everybody to Islam either by persuasion or by force. Therefore, caliphate and royal authority are united in Islam. So there's no separation of church and state or mosque and state. The person in charge can devote all the available strength to both of these tasks at the same time. The other religious groups did not have a universal mission, and the holy war was not a religious duty to them, save for the purposes of defense. Defense against whom? Well, defense against the invading Muslims, of course. The person in charge of religious affairs in other religious groups is not concerned with power politics. Royal authority has nothing to do with religion. Very interesting. Not because they are under obligation to gain power over other nations, as is the case with Islam, they are merely required to establish their religion among their people. Fascinating. This is one of the finest scholars in Islam, and he's telling us Islam has to rule by force and convert by force and invade with force. And let's continue. So the man who invented modern history, this is from the Prospect. It's from Reagan to Zuckerberg, the enduring relevance of a 14th century Arab historian. And there is on the Tunisian dinar. Let's go on from another chapter, another page in his book, Islamic War by Sea, it's called. The non-Arab nations became servants, he means slaves of the Arabs, and were under their control. And then he speaks of that these craftsmen offered them their best services and so on. And of course, the Muslims wished to wage the holy war by sea. They embarked the army and fighters to fight against the unbelievers across the sea. Now, 100 years after Muhammad supposedly died in 632, in 732, the Muslims were 20 kilometers from the capital of France, which is Paris. I don't believe that the Parisians at any stage attacked the Middle East. The French went there, the Europeans went there. They traveled all across North Africa, up through the Straits of Gibraltar, crossed into Spain, went up into France within 100 years of Muhammad's death. This has nothing whatsoever to do with any European invasions of the Middle East. So then they speak of the governor of Ifriqiya, that a shipyard to be set up for the production of maritime implements because he was desirous of waging the holy war. From there, the conquest of Sicily was achieved. Just a brief discussion on this, which tells us that this was all about invasion and warfare. Islam is a religion of warfare. So yes, Islam was spread by the sword. I can go on at length. With example, jihad is defined as warfare legally under the Sharia. Jihad, yes, you can say it's struggle because that's the colloquial definition, but legally in the Sharia, jihad is defined as warfare against non-Muslims to establish Islam. This is the legal and the final definition of jihad. Going on, Thaddeus. Yep.
Yes. So just to summarize what you said, he makes this claim that forcible conversion is prohibited in Islam. And, this is a good example, actually, of the ways that Muslim apologists get away with lying and tell themselves they're not lying. So to us, that looks like a lie because, you can threaten someone at say, convert or die, whatever. But Islam doesn't define that as forcible conversion. The Quran says that it's impossible to make someone convert, that it's only Allah that can make someone convert. So it doesn't matter what you do. You can do unlimited violence and it's not conversion by force because only Allah can make someone convert. You can't do anything to make someone convert. So in his mind, this is true, that you can't forcibly convert someone because it's physically impossible. But in our mind, it's an outright lie.
Well, he says, for instance, Muslims ruled Spain and India for 1,000 years without the vast majority of the population converting to Islam. The Mughals murdered, 80 million Hindus? And of course, Hindus had two options, convert or die. Many of them chose to fight. They were invaded, so why would they want to? And also, they made dhimmis. We've discussed on this channel the issue of dhimmis and how dhimmis are effectively semi-slaves who are worked, and half of their labor needs to be paid in tribute to the Muslims. So none of this is really true when you really unpack it. He doesn't go into, they'll tell us, well, under Islam, we protect the other religions. Well, go to the Sharia, open it, and show me the chapters that explain this in detail, and you'll find it is a brutal slavery.
Yeah, mercy in Islam is saying you're allowed to pay us a tax and admit that you're a second-class citizen. You agree that you'll never rebuild your church even if it falls down. Not try to convert to anyone, never talk about your religion in public. If you do all those things, then you can maintain your Christian or Jewish religion. If you're in any other religion, you're just totally out of luck. You don't even have that option. And that's what religious tolerance and mercy is in Islam. If you pay us money and you keep quiet and you feel inferior to us, then you can stay a Christian.
Yeah. I mean, this last point he makes, because I'll probably bring up one more slide after this, but your thoughts on this last point. This is our final slide.
Yeah. So this is what he's telling his audience. He's saying, you may clarify that the Islamic stance on violence and terrorism and stress that Islam encourages scientific advancement. Okay, first of all, even if Islam encouraged scientific advancement, that has nothing to do with violence. Second of all, Islam doesn't encourage scientific advancement, so it's a lie and it's irrelevant. And then he says that the Quran prohibits compulsion in religion, but what it actually does is say that compulsion in religion is impossible when you read the verse in context. Muslims, it's probably the most favorite verse in the West is that there is no compulsion in religion, but if you actually go to the Quran and look at what it's actually saying, it's saying it's impossible to compel someone to believe because it's all up to Allah. He decides who believes, he decides who disbelieves. You can't do anything.
Yeah, that's Quran 2:256, but that is abrogated by Quran 385, which says whoever wants a religion other than Islam, never will it be accepted of it. I just throw that back. And then let me show a few things. For instance, just to bring up one or 2 points to refute that. One way the Khalifa or the Caliph, because obviously once they establish their hegemony, they need a Khalifa to lead them, is one way the Khalifa may be chosen is through the use of force. A person who seizes power is legitimate Khalifa. If someone forces himself on the Ummah, he should be accepted. Forceful seizure of power by someone is legitimate. After someone has seized power, he is legitimate, so long as he follows the Quran and the Sunnah. This is from an authoritative discussion on the law, the Sharia law, defining Islam and the leadership. So therefore, you have these violent coups because it's considered norm in Islam. Looking into another's house without leave. This is from the world's most famous Sharia manual, The Reliance of the Traveler, known as the Umdat al-Salik. The Prophet said, if a man looks at you without permission and you threw a rock at him and knocked out his eye, you would not have committed any offense. So if you blind someone for just looking at you that is legal in Islam, because the Prophet says this, section P75.22 of the Sharia. Whoever peeps into a house without its people's permission, they may put out his eye. Yeah, no violence in Islam. It's not about that, right? And yeah, that's incredible. And let me just skip forward. They speak of jihad, right? The obligatory character of jihad. Jihad is a communal obligation. People have to perform it, right? And they speak of there are two possible states. The first is when foreigners are in their own countries, in which case jihad is a communal obligation. And this is what our author means when the Muslims must make jihad upon them, right? And they're allowed, as I said, the definition, full legal definition of jihad is to make war on non-Muslims for the purpose of spreading Islam. For instance, this example, there are 5 levels of forbidding the right, forbidding the wrong, commanding the right. They speak of forcibly stopping acts such as breaking musical instruments or pouring out wine, smashing wine bottles, intimidation, threatening to strike the person or hitting them to stop what they are doing. This is what Islam teaches. So yeah, how do you reconcile that with Islam stresses scientific advancement and not throwing rocks at people?
Well, like I said, I guess you could do both. I mean, you could throw rocks at people and give money to the sciences. You can do both. But of course, Islam doesn't actually encourage scientific advancement in the slightest. That's just total nonsense. If Islam actually encouraged science, then we would probably see at least a decent percentage of the scientific advancements coming from Muslim countries, but we actually only see scientific advancements coming, 99% from Christian countries and India and China.
Yeah, the entire Islamic world produces fewer books annually, writes and prints and publishes fewer books annually than Spain. That's insane. Those are insane statistics. So yeah, yeah.
I was just going to read a comment from the chat, but go ahead.
No, go on. That's fine.
Okay. DHC21 says that Allah misguides whom he wills. How can you convert someone in that case? And
exactly.
Yeah, we talked about this a little in the first episode, how what Islam actually teaches is very deterministic, that Allah is in control of everything. Everything happens because Allah wills it. There's not really anything you can do. You don't have any free will. And Bilal certainly knows that. He's a scholar. He's well learned. He knows these core texts, but most Muslims don't know this material. Most Muslims, they think they have free will. They think that their own actions determine whether they go to paradise or hell. So he's walking this very difficult balance. Like, he wants Muslims to go out and do Dawa, but at the same time, he knows that it doesn't really have any effect on who converts or not, according to Islamic teachings. So he says stuff like, you should do Dawa because it's your obligation to put out a good image of Islam. It's your obligation to give the message. If they convert or not, you don't worry about it. That's not in your control. Just make sure you give a good image. You make Islam look good. You give the message. So he's walking that very difficult line. And I agree. If Allah actually guides who he wills and misguides who he wills, which is straight from the Quran, then Dawa is pointless. Living under the Islamic moral code is pointless. Allah just arbitrarily decides who goes to heaven and who goes to hell anyway. So it's a major fundamental contradiction in Islam at the very core. And of course, if Allah makes some people disobey him and then punishes for them, then he can't possibly be good by any reasonable accounting of good and evil, because the people had no choice. He forced them to do that, and then he punishes them for it.
Yeah, it's insane. It says here the scriptural basis. This is from the Sharia again, the Reliance of the Traveler, the world's most famous Sharia manual. The scriptural basis for jihad before the scholarly ijma are these verses, fighting is prescribed for you, slay them wherever you find them, and fight the idolaters utterly. And I've been commanded to fight the people until they testify there's no God but Allah, and that Muhammad is the messenger. Now, and such hadiths as related by Bukhari and Muslim. Now, this is what the Sharia says. There's no ambiguity here. They're saying you have to fight people until they say the Shahada and become Muslim, right? And they tell us the details concerning jihad are found in the accounts of the military expeditions of Muhammad. Now, if you read through the Sirah, because the Sirah means it comes from war. That's the biographies of Muhammad. They call them the Sirah and the Sirah now known as the biographies of Muhammad, but Sirah actually means warfare. So the Sirah used to be the wars of Muhammad, right? They don't tell you that little bit of history, but yeah, jihad here is about military warfare. And if you read through those books, you read through those stories, it's all about, we give you 3 days, and if you don't surrender, we will kill you unless you say the Shahada and become Muslim and join us. And that's everything from me, I think that is.
Yep, I think that pretty much sums it up. We'll have one more part of this series where we will look at the section on how to do Dawa to Christians. There's also sections on how to do Dawa to atheists and polytheists and whatnot. So if you're interested in that, check out the manual. But our main point here isn't necessarily to answer his arguments. I mean, his arguments are pretty bad. So, if all you got out of this was that he made some bad arguments, then we failed, because what we really want to do is give an insight to the way the Muslim mind works, the way they are taught to think, because this is a manual teaching Muslims how to think, so that you can better understand your Muslim brothers, your Muslim neighbors and whatnot, and be able to better reach them by understanding the way they think. That we have this idea that Islam is based on the Quran because Christianity is based on the Bible. That's not really accurate. And as long as you're only talking about the Quran, you're only touching like 10% of their beliefs or something. So fundamentally, there might be a lot of cognitive dissonance problems if you show that the Quran's false, but fundamentally you'd only be showing that a very small percentage of what Islam teaches is actually false by showing the Quran is false. So I want people to understand that Islam is based mostly on the teaching of authority figures, that most Muslims' confidence is based entirely on what their authority figures have taught them. A good percentage of Muslims don't read the Quran in their native language. They only read it in Arabic, and they don't speak.
But they don't even know the Sharia, which is
right.
far more important to the scholars than the Quran.
So hopefully what we've shown is how the techniques more than the specific arguments that are used, that attempts to distract. What I try to do in online conversations with Muslims, it's a lot easier to do in real life, but even online I try to do it, is they try to change the subject, and it's like, no, we're not talking about the Bible. I'd like to answer your questions, you to answer my questions, and after you've answered those, then you can ask me whatever you want. But until you've given me answers for why you're a perfect example for all humanity to follow, married a 6-year-old girl and then raped her at age 9, until you've given an explanation for that, I don't really care what you think about the Bible. You need to actually defend your religion. We see that they bring up irrelevant things and just saying, that's not relevant. That doesn't help your case. I can grant that point, even if it's false, because it doesn't help your case. So how about you bring up something relevant? Just keep redirecting the conversation to what you're actually talking about. Don't let them distract. Don't let them change the subject. Don't let them bring up irrelevancies. With this issue of Muhammad's child bride, they'll say, well, King so-and-so had a child bride. And you're like, well, great. I don't care what King so-and-so did. That's totally irrelevant. He's not an example for me to follow. Muhammad is an example for you to follow. So how about you tell me whether it's right or not?
Yeah, ask him, how many child brides did Jesus have versus Muhammad? Let's work this out.
Yep. So like I said, we'll have one more episode on this subject, and then we will move on to talking about possibly we're looking at talking about the Muslim Brotherhood, about their plans or at least desires for world domination, and how that would all tie into end times prophecies and such.
Well, their plan for world domination first hinges on American Revolution and taking over the USA. So that's the frightening thing. What we're seeing today in the US corresponds exactly with what they have in their written documents that were captured by the FBI. So.
Absolutely. So that should be a very interesting discussion. Stay tuned for that. I'll be learning as much as the audience will. Lloyd's done quite a bit of research on this. He actually researched it for his profession. So, he's done a lot of work on this subject. I just have very basic knowledge. So I'm very excited about that discussion as well. In the meantime, we'll be back here about 2 weeks to finish up Dawa. Be sure to check out my channel as well as Lloyd's. We both put out additional material about Islam. I released a video yesterday looking at how ignorance and censorship are the fundamental beliefs, fundamental tactics of Islamic scholarship. That it's primarily about keeping the average Muslim ignorant. Only scholars are allowed to talk about these subjects, because if you gave the details to the average person, they would probably reject Islam because the details are pretty bad.
Yeah.
Anything you'd like to say to close us out?
I know that's it for me. One other subject we could speak about, the Crusades. I have a lot of good notes on the Crusades. We might want to put that one to rest at some point. But yeah, that's it from us. Thank you. I hope this has been helpful to you. And understanding the mindset, and this is the kind of mindset they want to perpetuate. And yeah, we need to refute it.
Absolutely. So take any of our material, share it, reuse it, and take out a clip and add your own commentary to it. Whatever you want to do, translate it to our language, whatever. All the content's freely available. We don't have any care about our copyright laws for these. We're free releasing it, so use the material however best benefits the Lord. Thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day. God bless.
Good weekend. Thanks, everyone. God bless.